All right, everyone can see that? Cool. All right, so it's just how to find our organization. Move on. So when I first moved to DC, I was wondering, and before I even moved there, I was asking people, what are the environmental justice issues in the city? And basically, no one can tell me anything. And sometimes people say, the Anacostia. I was like, well, okay, what about the Anacostia? It has litter in it. Like, all right, you try a little harder. The I don't consider that as much of an environmental justice issue per se, although I know there are some folks in here who argue with that. But as someone who mostly is fighting industrial facilities and looking at things that are more like big institutional polluters, I was looking at that. And it took me several years until I ran into someone who was fighting one of the trash transfer stations in the Black community, where they've been fighting it for about 30 years. And most of the white environmentalists weren't even aware of this to tell me, although I now know some who have followed it, and Neil in particular is one. So thanks for being here, Neil. And as I learned about this, I realized that all 5 trash transfer stations in the city are in the Black community, and a lot of the other major industrial hazards also. So I put this map together a while ago just to show the environmental racism trends in the city. But after our waste gets transferred through, especially the ones, if you can see my pointer, the one in Fort Houghton and the one in Benning Road, which are the 2 city-owned, sorry, Benning Road is here, there's 2 city-owned trash transfer stations. Then there are a few private ones, and one's getting shut down and taken away with their eminent domain. And this one had a fire recently. So basically it's all going through Fort Houghton right now. But they're all clustered in the Black community. And after the waste goes through the city-owned ones, it ends up going down to Lorton, Virginia. Now, Lorton is where DC used to put its unwanted people. We had a suite of prisons there for many years. And those prisons started around 1910. And over time, they built up one landfill after another around it. I think in the 60s or 70s, landfill gases in the closest landfill to the prison actually got into the prison and blew up and killed one of the prisoners. And I believe I heard there were some kind of riots that ended up associated with that. Plenty of reason to be angry about that. And eventually that prison was closed. And I learned about it first because I was still living in Pennsylvania, helping people fight a federal prison. That's where these prisoners got transferred to, so they can get them valuable land around here. But after they shut down that prison, they built this neighborhood that I took this picture of. And you can see in the western end of the western view is this giant thick smokestack. That's the 3rd largest trash incinerator in the country, run by Covanta. And if you can see behind that, you'd see the county's landfill. And if you took a look on the southern horizon, which I have another picture of later, you see a construction demolition waste landfill where a lot of demolished buildings from DC and Northern Virginia end up going. And if you went to the other side of the highway, you'd find there's a sewage sludge incinerator that's a huge lead emitter, and a 3rd landfill for industrial waste. So this is a serious concentration of pollution that's happening in an area where the people who ended up populating this nice looking development turned out to be, at the time, last time I looked at the numbers, it was the 12th most diverse community of color in the country. And they are penned in on 3 walls. So you can only get in and out of one road. And basically they're surrounded by these big industrial facilities that are waste facilities. So they burn up to 3,000 tons per day in that big smokestack you see. A fifth of that, 1 out of 5 trucks is waste from DC. And they're the largest air polluter within at least 25 miles of the district. They're so dirty that even their home state, Covanta's home state of New Jersey, they're not owned by a Swedish company, but they used to be based in New Jersey. And their home state said they're too dirty to sell renewable energy credits to New Jersey's program. So they're not allowed to do that, but they can sell them to Maryland, which we'll talk about. Now, in 2017, there was this huge fire that was 3 stories of trash burning uncontrolled for about 2 weeks, shut down the facility for 11 months until the end of the year. So the fire started on February 2nd. And I remember going there with a gas mask 2 days into the fire with my roommate, going door to door in that community. And they were lied to. They were told, oh, it's just a recycling plant on fire. There's nothing to worry about because it's not going to affect your health, because it's just normal household waste burning, even though it's also industrial waste. And even though normal household waste burning requires 4 pollution control devices, and they're still the largest air polluter within the region. So this is when they testified before DC and said, oh, these are becoming more prevalent, because a few months ago, or sorry, a few months before that, in late 2016, the Covanta incinerator in Montgomery County, Maryland, also had a trash pile fire that lasted almost 2 weeks. It didn't do as much damage as this one did, though. But that's something that's becoming a trend. There was just a recent one in an incinerator in New Hampshire, actually. So demographically, if you look at Fairfax County, most of the people of color are concentrated in the same place where a lot of the polluters are concentrated, where that red dot is, which is Covanta. And if you look at it in terms of income, you'll see, even though it's not a poor community, it's higher than the state and national average, but it's in the third wealthiest county in the country. And so it's relatively low income for Fairfax County. And a lot of times when we talk about environmental justice and environmental racism, a lot of white people in particular want to escape and say, oh, it's just about class, it's not about race. And what we found in studying this is that it's more race than class by far, especially in this industry, but in a lot of noxious industries in general, which is why you'll find polluters like this in places like Lorton, in places like various communities in Prince George's County, where their communities of color, and they're not poor, but they still get dumped on pretty badly. Now, I already mentioned some of these, so that's the picture of that construction demolition waste landfill I was describing. They wanted to add several stories to that, and people fought that off about 7 years ago, and we helped a bit with that. So the contract that DC is in right now came about in 2015, and I believe it was illegally rigged and in violation of the Civil Rights Act in doing so. And the reason I think that is, first of all, they did not let landfills even bid on where DC's waste would go. They said they like to call them waste to energy facilities, which is not a real legitimate term. They don't turn waste into energy. They turn it into toxic ash and toxic air pollution. But they said waste to energy facilities within 50 miles of DC's 2 transfer stations are the only ones that can apply to get the contract to take DC's waste. And they knew that there were only 4 incinerators within that radius: Baltimore, Montgomery County, Alexandria, and Lorton, Covanta, Fairfax. The one of those 4 facilities that's in a white community is in Montgomery County, and they don't take out of county trash, and DC knew that. So they're basically saying that only 3 incinerators in communities of color are eligible to even get DC's trash. And they knew that 2 of them didn't have the space. And so they basically rigged the contract so that only Covanta Fairfax could even bid on it, and they were the only bidder, and they got the contract, which was a 5-year contract plus 2 3-year renewal options. We had 21 groups that opposed it, including NAACP, Institute for Local Self-Reliance, a bunch of different groups from health, environmental, business, and other perspectives. And we all got ignored, and they went ahead and approved that contract anyway. But in 2020, when the 5 years came up, I've been working with Councilmember Che's office, and she chairs the Environment and Transportation Committee, which oversees the Department of Public Works, which did the contract. And she wrote a very powerful letter that was in the outreach email I did for this. So I hope you all get a chance to look at that. I have some quotes from that, but you should read the whole thing. And it opposed the 3-year extension and said that that DPW should do a 1-year extension, which does not require council approval, and use that time to do the studies that they promised her committee in 2018 that they would do. They promised in a hearing before her committee that they would get the prices of alternatives, of landfills, and see how much they cost, and that they would do a life cycle assessment and compare to the alternatives and see what that really looks like. And then they drag their feet for 3 years. And after she pressures them in 2020, they finally do one part of that, and they do a life cycle assessment, which is what we're here to criticize. So we'll walk you through that. But before that happened, and what led to that even being requested by the council, is that we had already done a life cycle assessment in 2017. And we found that burning DC's trash in Covanta, Fairfax, and Lorton was worse for most measures and in general, including global warming and a number of other things, even associated with the trucks. The position of the city has been, oh, the trucks are such a problem. We truck further to a landfill. That's just way worse. And so we can't do that. And we also found, separate from the life cycle assessment, that it's worse to incinerate in terms of cost, the number of people impacted, environmental racism, and even the amount of jobs produced, which thank you, Brenda from Institute for Local Self-Reliance, for the data point on that in Maryland, showing that even landfills produce more jobs than incinerators, about 80% more. So our study, and we actually hired the leading consultant in this field, basically, who has a life cycle assessment model that can look at 9 different criteria at once. And we found that for most of them, incineration in the yellow was worse than landfilling, whether you look at it over 20 years or 100 years, because that can vary with global warming, how you evaluate that. And the travel distance. One of these sets of bars is the landfill that's about twice as far from the incinerator or from the city as the incinerator is, and the others are 3 other landfills we studied are about 4 times as far. And on global warming specifically, we found that it was worse. And everyone knows that methane is terrible for global warming, which is true. And we used the latest science to show really how bad it is over 20 years, 86 times. Actually, newer data says it's about 82 times, but about the same. So over 20 years, methane is really bad, and you're getting that from landfills. But you have so much more carbon coming out of the smokestacks of incinerators because everything, all the carbon goes up the smokestack and right away. Whereas in a landfill, some of that stays there and is sequestered. So especially the plastics, they're not breaking down like food scraps are, turning into methane. And when you add up all the criteria at once, and I actually have a better slide on this, I guess right here. If you add up all the criteria, like we did in our more recent study in Montgomery County, you find that incineration is far worse than landfills for global warming, which is in blue, for particulate matter, which affects people getting heart attacks and strokes, for the asthma-inducing nitrogen oxides that form smog, and for the toxic chemicals that cause birth defects and other problems. And there are many other impacts, but there's smaller ones in here. And collectively, when you are able to add it all up in one slide by putting a money value to it, which is the economists that made this model, they're able to put money values to anything. So you can add it all up and show it on one slide. You can see it's far worse, more than twice as bad to incinerate than to landfill, even though you're trucking it much further to get to landfills. In the Montgomery County study, we actually teased out the information on transportation. So all the yellow is the landfills, the red is the Montgomery County incinerator, and the blue is the trucking. And some we have rail access, so the black is by rail. And you can see that that's a tiny slice of the impact, is even if you have to truck it hundreds of miles, you can see some of these are 200, 300 some miles away by truck or 600 by rail. And still, it pales in comparison to the actual waste facilities themselves or to the incinerator. So the model that we use is this one called Monetizing Environmental Benefits Calculator, or MEBCalc. It looks at all these different criteria. The one that was used by the consultants for part of their study, and the one that was also used against the community of Montgomery County by the county government, is this EPA model called WORM. It's waste awareness and reduction models. I'm probably butchering that acronym, but that's a life cycle assessment just for global warming impacts of waste systems. And when we met with EPA just recently, they admitted that that WORM model, even though they have about 15, 16 versions of it out, has never been peer reviewed, and they're willing to revisit it because we've critiqued it to the point where they realized, we should take another look at this because we haven't actually had a legitimate peer review on that. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So the letter from Councilmember Chang, this is just the top of it here, but a few pieces that are worth pulling out. She pointed out that it's increasingly clear that incineration is harmful to marginalized communities, that trash incinerators release a number of different pollutants she's describing, and that they're even worse than coal power plants, which we've documented with EPA data, and they cause a number of health impacts. She said in that letter in late 2020, she would oppose a 3-year extension and say, do a 1-year extension and use that time to do the studies that you said you would do in 2018. And then evaluate it and then make a contract decision based on that. So what did they do? They hired CDM Smith. And I want to pause here and just tell a joke that illustrates something very well. I didn't make this up, but it goes, what is the difference between a philosopher, a mathematician, and an environmental consultant? And the answer is, if you ask a mathematician, what is 2 + 2 equal? They'll tell you 2 + 2 = 4. If you ask a philosopher, they'll tell you, well, it depends on what your definition is of 2, 4, plus, and equals. Well, if you ask an environmental consultant, they'll take you in the back room and say, well, what do you want it to equal? And it's sad to say that that is so true. And we knew, especially when we looked into CDM Smith's background and found that they were bragging about having been part of building the only new incinerator built in this country in 27 years. And that's the one in West Palm Beach, Florida. You can even see the little burning part of the eye in their logo is a smokestack with a flame coming out of it. So they might be a little biased on this. And we found that they also helped expand another incinerator in Florida, helped build one in Dublin, but they helped close landfills. So they have a very strong preference for incinerators over landfills, and that's been clear from other things they've written. And yet they were the ones hired to do the study. Now, one of the tools that they used, another fun quote, and this is from someone who used to head the US EPA under, I think it was under Reagan and one other president. He said, "We should remember that risk assessment can be likened to the captured spy. If you torture it long enough, it will tell you anything you want to know." And sadly, that's pretty true. And in the CDM Smith study, they used that instead of doing the type of analysis that we had done with the MEDCalc model, they used a risk assessment approach that looks at how much of a pollutant is going to reach a certain person at a certain distance, and what's the concentration of that pollutant. So because the trash incinerator at Covanta has such a tall smokestack that spews the much greater amount of pollution than landfills emit over such a large region that covers DC, I'm sure, because some of the pollutants go as far as the Canadian Arctic. The dioxins do that. They are basically able to say, okay, well, don't worry, because we spread the harm around enough that, no one exceeds any kind of threshold that we deem harmful. And so they saw this as acceptable in their study. Now, in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, where I've been working with Kearney and Tom and others, they put together a request for proposals last year that asks the zero waste consultants that they hired to do a life cycle assessment, and specifically put in there that they should avoid doing the things that DC just did in the CDM Smith study. They said avoid double counting with climate models by basically count all the carbon that comes out. Don't subtract half of the carbon because it's biogenic, as they often do in these models. And also don't count fossil fuels displaced by the energy generation, because that's not fair to do, because they compete within certain laws that say you have to produce energy from certain things. And in Maryland, where the Covanta Fairfax incinerator sells its energy to Maryland's renewable portfolio standard, they compete with wind power. So you can't say, oh, we're displacing fossil fuels when a utility is legally obligated in Maryland, if they don't buy incineration energy, to replace that with wind or solar or something that fits in that tier 1 in Maryland's law. So these are the two main points of our critique of how this study was biased, that they're assuming that fossil fuels are displaced, and they're not counting most of the carbon emissions that come out of the incinerator. And when we fought them on this, we actually got a meeting. It was me versus 6 CDM Smith consultants at once in a Zoom. And we went through all the things, and they met us a slightly part of the way on the biogenic thing and say, okay, well, there are certain parts that are longer term carbon that trees don't suck up readily. So we'll count that carbon, but the stuff from food scraps, yard waste, most of the biogenic carbon, they're going to pretend it doesn't exist anyway, because they say it's short term, which is very arguable. A lot of that stuff will stay in a landfill if you put it in a landfill, so not all of it comes out. And so it's unfair bias they put in. So one of the things that was revealing when I looked at their report and their conclusions, they assumed that they were displacing fossil fuel power, but they also put in some alternative scenarios and say, well, in the future, we might have more renewable energy. And let's assume there's 50% renewable energy later. And of course, Maryland counts incineration as renewable, but for the sake of, I think, even their argument, they're assuming that's not true. So they're saying, well, incineration is still preferable if we're up to 50% renewable, but if we get up to 90% renewable, then incineration becomes worse on greenhouse gases. And this is with all their other biases cooked in. But the fact is that 100% renewable energy is being displaced because this plant is still defined as renewable energy in Maryland. And they're selling credits, they're making somewhere between $4 and $7 million a year selling renewable energy credits to utilities that are ultimately the bills being paid by ratepayers in Maryland. So what I just described is a lot of the main acrobatics that the industry uses to argue that they're a climate solution. This is actually from the mouthpiece of the industry's trade association called the Energy Recovery Council. And you can see that their emissions, their total emissions supposedly are here in this diagram. And yet they first thing they do is say, well, this part doesn't count. Chop the green part off automatically. That's biogenic. And the argument over how much is even biogenic, that's been changing. There's more plastics in the waste stream now. But they take that away. And then they say, well, we're displacing fossil fuels. So now we're down here. We're already negative. And, we recover some metals because, our ash has metals in it that we can pull out and recycle. So we're going to count the energy that it takes to make new steel and subtract that because we're recycling, which there's some legitimacy of that. And then they say, we're also going to subtract what landfills normally emit. And that's just really dirty. You can't compare yourself to landfills and then have them subtracting each other. That just makes no sense. But that's what they try to do. And so they ultimately get to this point where there's such a climate solution. It's like, why wouldn't you ever want a trash incinerator in your backyard? Because we're obviously the answer. So when I looked at this report from CDM Smith, I found that they didn't even give the amount of greenhouse gases that are coming out of the smokestack or out of the landfills before this whole acrobatic starts. They give you the conclusion. They say the net emissions using this global warming potential. And so you can see the only data they're even presenting into the city shows that incineration is less of an emitter than landfills, even though it's a far greater one if you actually look at the real emissions data on what's coming out of the smokestack. This is after all the subtractions they're presenting it to the city. Now, if you look at other pollutants, the criteria pollutants are the major ones that EPA regulates under the Clean Air Act, and also the HAPs, which are hazardous air pollutants. And sorry for all the acronyms. This is CDM Smith's slide. I usually prefer to spell things out. But you got volatile organic compounds, which a lot of them cause cancer. Nitrogen oxides triggers asthma, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide with acid rain and respiratory problems. Particulate matter, especially the fine stuff, causes heart attacks and strokes, and lead, which causes learning disabilities. And the hazardous air pollutants, you got mercury, dioxin, things that cause all kinds of cancers and other stuff. And if you look at these numbers, you'll see that the incinerator is, except for two pollutants, VOCs and carbon monoxide, they're far worse than the landfills on all the points. And if you total them, look at the totals, you'll see they're far worse. So they're admitting this in their own report. Incinerators are worse on air pollution, even with the transportation, which you'll see the transportation, which is similar to what I found in our own studies. They're a small piece of the puzzle. Most of the emissions are coming out of the facilities, the waste facilities, not the trucks. Now, another part of this bias that I saw, and this smacked a lot of what we saw in Montgomery County recently too. They did an environmental justice analysis where, first of all, they put transportation on equal playing field as the facilities, which we know from their own data on the previous slide is not true. Transportation is a tiny part of what the impacts are, but it gets equal weight when they evaluate environmental justice. And they looked at all the communities along the path where the trucks go to add these hauling numbers. So that's part of how they're cooking even their environmental justice analysis. But they also cooked it by counting race just twice. They put it in the EJ communities category and minority population, and class 5 times, here again, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 other ones that overlap with class. Well, the landfills are in lower income, but predominantly white communities. And the incinerator is, because it's so close to DC and in a wealthier community, it's a community color and large, very diverse population of people of color there, but it's not poor. So if you weight the economic criteria 5 times in this analysis and the race criteria twice, of course, you get to the point where, especially after you add all the hauling, as if that is as important, where the landfills look like they're having more of an environmental justice impact than the incinerator, which is so laughable, knowing this community, knowing where they're located, having run the numbers on it, and seeing the kind of tricks they have to pull to make an environmental justice argument that somehow the incinerator is less of an impact, which is just this is what institutional racism looks like, to be honest. It's sickening to see them do this. And they did the same kind of thing in Montgomery County last year. They put together stuff where they were weighting the same things multiple times and didn't even take a serious consideration of population. They weighted the total amount of people impacted with 4% of the total and gave heavier weight to everything else so they can cook the numbers. But when we just put in more reasonable things on there and stopped double counting the same criteria and looked at race once and class once and population with a more serious lens, because the amount of people impacted is arguably more important than anything. You know, if fewer people are impacted, that's a good thing. And then you find completely opposite results on which facilities are recommended for Montgomery County. So just looking at the demographics, we see the population within 5 miles of the Covanta Fairfax incinerator is 103,000. This is the 2010 census. I don't have the newer numbers on this slide yet. But the people of color percent is 54%, and the income is much higher. And then the landfills, the first two are the ones that they looked at. We looked at 2 additional ones. But you see far, far fewer people are being impacted. They're mostly white, and they're not that poor, at least not in King George. This is a little bit more in the middle. But far fewer people. And so if you're trying to just do the right thing in terms of less harm to people, you'd think, well, gee, let's bring it to a place with fewer people being impacted, especially when an incinerator spreads that impact around far more than a 5-mile radius. So you got millions of people actually being impacted by this pollution, whereas the landfill pollution reaches maybe this range of people at best, but not nearly as many as the millions impacted in the DC area by having a tall smokestack spread that everywhere. So one of the other things that they put in this study, which just, it shocked me how brazen they can be, is that they argue that it's cheaper to use Covanta's incinerator than the landfills without getting any bids and without even looking into the history that they should have known, because I shared this recently with the DPW. Now, there were 2 times that the Department of Public Works admitted that every time that they, in the past decade and a half, maybe 2 decades, allowed landfills to bid. They didn't do that in 2015, but the previous times there were 9 vendors that bid in 2004 and 5 in 2009. And all 14 bids, it was cheaper to go to a landfill. And this is in testimony before Chase Committee in 2012 by the head of the Department of Public Works. These are the only times since 2004 that landfills have been allowed to bid. They weren't allowed in 2015, so these are all the RFPs that came out. So every time landfills were cheaper. In 2017, when I talked to the landfill managers at 4 of the landfills that we studied, I asked them at the time, hey, if you were given a contract of 5 to 11 years like Covanta got, even with the extra trucking distance, do you think you can beat Covanta's price? Could you be competitive and give a competitive offer? And every single one of them said, yeah, I think we could do that. But because of this religious like belief that incineration is better than landfilling, because they can't back it up with legitimate data, they said at the time, you know, oh, we thought it was better environmentally to landfill it anyway, even though we know it's more costly to do that. And we got this again later in documents from a FOIA request to the Department of Public Works, where they also admitted here, all 3 companies had a lower cost when they bid to haul trash to a landfill much further away than it would be to Covanta Fairfax. So how CDM Smith can just contradict the whole history of DC's bidding and say, oh yeah, it's going to be cheaper to use the incinerator, when they estimated, they didn't have any real data to back that up. So last few things I want to point out here that stood out when I read this. They chose not to even evaluate the impacts of ash disposal. And they did that arguing that, well, incinerator ash disposal doesn't generate gas, so therefore it doesn't contribute to criteria air pollutants, hazardous air pollutants, or greenhouse gas emissions. And some of that is right, but the hazardous air pollutants, the toxic metals, the dioxins, the things that blow off the landfill or off of the trucks when they're hauling that ash around, or leach into groundwater when rainwater seeps through it, that is something they could have tried to study, and they didn't even look at that. And that's what makes landfills more dangerous if you put ash in them than if you put trash, is the higher surface area of that fine ash and rainwater trickling through it, pouring things out that normally would sit in the landfill, but now they can escape more readily. that plus the more toxic chemicals that wouldn't be there if not for the combustion process that took place. And they also, I thought this was cute because just this past week or so, the UN's report, the IPCC report came out saying that global warming is far worse than we even predicted. And yet here in this study, they're saying, well, we thought we'd use a social cost metric for greenhouse gases as a moderate climate change scenario. So I think we're past the point of thinking moderate climate change scenarios make sense. But anyway, on that ash blowing off of landfills point for Baltimore, where Steph's been working with me on fighting the incinerator there, the state government actually wrote this letter. This is going back 12 years now, but they wrote to the city and said, stop using their incinerator ash as landfill cover material because it's blowing off of the landfill into the community. And that is something that all the other landfills claim is not an issue, but maybe they just haven't been inspected enough. But here it's saying, oh, it washes or blows away if it's exposed. And yet DC in their contracts required that the ash from burning their trash gets used as landfill cover. Actually, I don't know if it was a requirement, as a preference at least, but that was encouraged by DC's Department of Public Works. So I'll leave it there. We will talk about next steps. Maybe let me just say quickly what my big next step is, and then we'll do questions. We would like to get a bill introduced in City Council, and I would like all of your help with this, to ban Department of Public Works from signing any contracts to burn its trash, recyclables, or compostables. I think there's enough frustration with Department of Public Works right now based on their behavior of ignoring council requests and doing biased models like this, that we might have the political traction to get that done, at least while Councilmember Che is still in office the rest of this year. I welcome any help with that, any questions about it, and let's just open this up.
I know Neil's raring to go, and then there was one chat that came from Nathan way long time ago, but go ahead, Neil. Oh, come off mute.
Thanks, Steph, and thanks, Mike, for this detailed report. Very quickly, have you given an official response to the DPW of your findings? And number two, have any media news media been alerted as of yet?
Aside from critiquing it before it even happened, I'm anticipating this. I have not given feedback to DPW on it. I only got to read it over in full for the first time just recently. And we've not done any media work on this. We're not really eager to advertise such a bad study. It was interesting that a previous pro-incinerator consultant that DPW hired to do a bias study, that was Arcadis, was so bad that even DPW didn't want it advertised, and the newer staff there, when they had an office of waste diversions, put it on a shelf and said, Mike, don't even request it, don't even put it out there, so bad, we're just going to pretend it didn't happen. So this is another case, but here they are proud of it and using it to justify continuing the status quo.
Thanks.
I want to point out there that we're going to be meeting with Mary Che directly, and incineration is one of the top 4 issues that we're going to be bringing up with her. And at that point, I think, Mike, that's a good opportunity for us to kind of pitch the bill, right? The legislation. And so anyway, so that's in the works as we speak. Who else? Let's see here. Erwin.
In the course of your discussion, I didn't hear anything about compliance with permits by Covanta, and in particular with any EPA permits for air pollution, or for requirements for testing and for complying with requirements on landfilling their bottom and fly ash.
Sure. So several things to know about this. First of all, they sometimes do have violations. All facilities do. I have not requested copies of them in a while, so I don't know currently how many violations they've been having. But the issue is not so much do they exceed the permits, and they're not EPA permits, they're actually issued by a state agency. So in this case, we're talking about DEQ. And they have had some controversies. Like I remember when I was looking at their files at the DEQ office some years ago, there was a lot of back and forth between the agency and Covanta about how often they need to test their ash. And Covanta was just refusing to test as often as the state requires. And New Jersey, even one of the reasons, there were two reasons why they can't sell renewable energy credits to New Jersey. One of them is their high levels of nitrogen oxides that don't meet New Jersey's standards. But the other one is that the ash testing wasn't up to New Jersey standards either. But this notion that somehow when they tell you, and Covanta is happy to tell you they're 90-something% below the standards and therefore it's safe and friendly and don't worry about it. Well, there are a lot of problems with that. First of all, the emissions levels in permits, the permit limits are not based on health and safety. They're technology-based standards. Part of the reason you know they're not based on health and safety is that if they were, there will be a certain amount of pollution that a community can absorb that would be deemed acceptable, even though there's no safe dose of a lot of pollutants anyway. And the permit would look at everything else out there and say, okay, well, you have this much room left, here's how much you can put out. But instead they have concentration-based limits. And so if they're a bigger facility, say if this were a 500 ton per day incinerator, it would be allowed to emit a certain amount. But since they're 6 times bigger than that, they're allowed to put out 6 times more pollution than that 500 ton per day incinerator. So it has nothing to do with health and safety. If you can be more dirty, if you can be dirtier just because you're bigger, which is how permits are designed with any facility of this sort. We also know that they only continuously test 3 pollutants at most incinerators. There might be a 4th at this one. I have to check if this is one of the ones that also does hydrochloric acid. I don't think it is. But you have sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and carbon monoxide that are continuously tested. Everything else they test once a year, if at all. And that is kind of like if we regulated motorists on the highway the same way we regulate smokestacks in the country. We would let people drive around with no speedometer all year. And once a year, there'll be a speed trap set on the highway. And there will be warning signs saying, warning, slow down, speed trap ahead. And the brother of the driver will be running the speed trap because they hire their own consultants or do the testing themselves. That's literally how every smokestack in this country is regulated, because they know ahead of time their best behavior tests, they're required to be done under best operating conditions. And so certain pollutants like dioxins, which they say is the lion's share of the toxic emissions, the cancer-causing emissions from this incinerator, when they did the comparison, is from dioxins, the most toxic chemicals known to science, which are 14,000 times more toxic than mercury. And they said that, well, if dioxins, like the main thing that is the value in terms of how toxic they are, well, we can't trust their data because they test that once a year, which is about a 6-hour test. And we know from studies in Europe that the actual levels of dioxin when they use continuous sampling technology for that pollutant, one study found it was 30 to 50 times higher than what we think that that level is in the US based on our once-a-year testing. Other studies found it was 600 to over 1,100 times higher than what we think it is in the US because we're not using continuous testing. So that alone would skew the whole results of this study on toxicity if they actually use proper testing. So I don't think there's any comfort in hearing that they're within their permit limits when they make those claims.
Susan, then Catherine, and then Nathan. We haven't forgotten you, but I thought we'd finish up on some of this, keep it germane, and then come back to your question. So Susan, go ahead. Oh, you're mute.
Thanks. I'm in Fairfax County, have a lot of volunteers actively on what we work on is in the Sierra Club Great Falls group, reducing waste that goes to the Covanta landfill for a lot of the reasons that you've talked about. But would you propose to DC as alternatives? And if it's landfills, I'm in Virginia Sierra Club, Charles City, and the county surrounding it has gotten very active recently, preventing new emissions projects, mostly pipelines, because there's a very organized community in environmental justice in Charles City. So they're probably working to close the landfill. But so what do you present as best options for DC?
Sure. So DC, first of all, much of its waste already goes to several landfills in southeastern DC. Some goes to King George landfill, some goes to King and Queen, the 2 landfills in the CDM Smith study, and some goes to about 3 or 4 other landfills in southeastern Virginia. Basically, all those landfills are in white communities that are more rural and impacting far fewer people. So we're not talking about the environmental justice community you just mentioned in Charles City. I know they're fighting that, and we would never recommend anything like that. We've actually been pushing back in Montgomery County, Maryland, where their incinerator ash has exclusively been targeting Black landfill communities, 2 of them in Virginia, one then the other, now one in Richmond area. And so part of our argument there is this is environmental racism, even though it's not where the incinerator is, but where the ash goes, it always has been going to Black communities with landfills. So the first thing, if we're going to do any kind of compliance with the Civil Rights Act, to be real about it, is don't dump on those communities, and don't dump on the communities that have a large population either, because we're not trying to hurt anyone. But there's a landfill at the end of the pipe no matter what you do. If you burn first, you have a smaller but more toxic landfill. If you go straight to the landfill, it's far less damaging, but still a problem, which is why the real answer is zero waste, which is defined to mean no incineration. Landfilling is a backstop in a zero waste system. And so when we're talking about something that has so much harm being done, like incineration, my belief is that the first step towards a sane and just waste management system is you get incineration off the table. And then you work hard to reduce the amount of waste going to landfills through all the other zero waste methods, so they can stretch out the life of those landfills and not need new or expanded ones.
If I could just add a footnote to Mike's last comment, if you ban incineration and ban organics from the landfill, you will just get roughly 10 to 15% of what we're sending there now, and it will be inert. And that is the ultimate solution. Hopefully that 15% with bans and design could get down to 2%, but whatever. At 90% is zero waste. And that's how you get to zero waste without incineration.
Catherine Plume?
Hi, I was just wondering about what the condition of the scrubbers are in the incinerator and where they stand vis-a-vis current EPA recommendations. Thanks.
Sure. So they have not just scrubbers, they have 4 pollution control devices, which most incinerators have, unless you're at the biggest one in the country, which is in Kearney's community in Chester. They're missing 2 of the 4. But this one has all 4 of the common pollution control devices, and they're still the huge polluter that they are on all these different pollutants, including the nitrogen oxides, global warming, mercury. Of course, there's no control for global warming emissions, so didn't even make sense to say. That goes right through. When they had that fire in 2017 that shut them down for 11 months, I believe they did replace their bag houses, which are one of the 4 filter systems. That's like the giant vacuum cleaner, but thousands of them, like sets of bags that take the particulate matter out to some degree. Of course, still a lot coming up. So I think those were upgraded or replaced. Not necessarily an upgrade, they were at least replaced. The rest, I think, are the same as they always have been. I don't know that there's any issue with them not meeting EPA requirements. But like I said, EPA requirements doesn't necessarily mean they're catching 100%. They never were designed to do that. They only capture a certain percent.
Nathan, why don't you go ahead with your question?
Oh, you may not know about this, but my question is about tires. We remove thousands and thousands of tires that are illegally dumped. We take them to Fort Taunton. I recently asked the head of solid waste for DC, or one of the top people, where they go from there, and he doesn't know. I've also talked to some tire shop owners who basically they're required to contract with a hauler to take their tires away, but they don't know where those haulers are taking them, and obviously some of them are dumping them on public land. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know where all the tires go in the region. I know there's been some international aspect of that, and there was an article in the past year about that. It was pretty horrible to see what's going on when they export them. But some also get burned at Covanta. I remember from Prince George's County running into data showing that their tires were getting burned at this Covanta incinerator in Lorton. I don't know if that's the same situation for DC or other parts of the region, but it could be.
Actually,
Go ahead.
yeah, just a little bit more information. The last decade or so, tires actually have not been going to landfill, but most of them have been burned, as Mike was giving some information. There's a lot of asphalt on playgrounds and road with stuff. It is being, and some of it is actually being used to remake rubber products. But most of the quote unquote recycling is shredding and going to incinerators.
We actually have the waste flow data for almost all the states now, and we've been collecting this state by state. And in Virginia, it does tell you how many tires are going to each facility. So we can tell you how many tons went to this Covanta plant per year based on what state they're from. So I could at least pull those numbers if you want to follow up with me, and that you know how many come from DC or Maryland or Virginia. I also dropped in the chat an analysis we did comparing tires to coal, because there's been such a push to burn tires in cement kilns to replace coal. And we found that for most pollutants, the best data out there that does a fair comparison of tires versus coal shows that for most pollutants, tires are more polluting than coal is to be burning.
Susan Shore.
Thanks, Chris. Mike, I'm just wondering if if you have data or somebody has data on what the composition of the trash that's being burned at the Covanta plant is. I think one of your slides mentioned, you know, numbers for plastic and maybe for organics, if I remember properly, because I'm wondering if we couldn't use that to push, you know, our zero waste agenda in DC, as was suggested by our Sierra Club colleague just a short while ago. I mean, we could, you know, I recently looked at the projections for plastic recycling that DPW published, and for next year, they're only planning 6.5% of the plastic trash to be recycled. So if there's a significant amount of what's being burned is plastic, we can argue that they need to up their game on recycling. And similarly, if it's organic materials, then we could use that to bolster our argument that we want to have distributed composting facilities. We want DPW to buy the property near Benning Road, the Pepco facility there for composting. I'm just wondering if we can't use these numbers to bolster our arguments for our other initiatives as well. Thanks.
Sure. So I have pieces of the answer, but first I want to see if Chris or Neil has a quick answer on when the last DC waste composition study was. So I know they've done some.
Yeah, but I think the question is not what our waste composition is. It's what's the waste composition that's going into excuse me, going into facility after recycling. And
exactly.
I do not know that data, and I don't know who would be collecting it. You'd literally have to be taking a sampling at the incinerator as it goes in. So I don't think
no one's collecting.
I'm sorry.
No one's collecting that data.
Right.
The only waste composition data that does exist is when counties or sometimes states or the district does their own waste sort. And so there is one from DC. I think there is one from Montgomery County. I'm not sure if Fairfax County has done one or when that last might have been. Thank you, Kathy. So I know they're out there, but you'd have to kind of compile those different ones and then get a sense of how much waste is coming from where. And Virginia's waste data is only collected by state, not by county. So you can't know how much of what's going there from Virginia is from certain counties, which makes it.
Oh, I see. Okay. But because you were saying that the consultants were arguing that X amount was biomass, for example, and X
they're just
plastic,
using
right?
National numbers. They're using national estimates that are changing from year to year. And yeah, that's what's in these models. It's not local data at all. Yeah. But one thing that's interesting on the plastics is, first of all, 4 of the 5 most valuable things in recycle bins right now are types of plastic. One of them is actually more valuable per ton than aluminum, which was shocking to see that be the case. And so a lot of people think, oh, plastics all end up in the ocean. There's no market. Nothing gets recycled because of all the PR around that. And that's very not the case. So the 1s, 2s, and 5s, it's at least the 1s and 2s are generally getting recycled and have a high price. It's the rest that don't that end up being burned or buried. And there's so much more plastic in the waste stream now that Covanta's actually complained about it and made a point that they love plastic recycling. Because what happens, and I learned this when I was on a tour of the incinerator in Baltimore a few years back, they admitted that they don't really compete with recycling like we thought. We thought they want the stuff that burns well, right? They want the stuff that doesn't burn well. They want the compost. They want to cool their machine down, because if they hit that limit because of too much plastic, their boilers are only rated at a certain amount of BTUs per hour. And they hit that limit because there's too much energy value going in if there's too much plastic. So they're happy to have the plastic out of there because they get paid per ton for all the waste going through, and they'd rather get more tons.
I wanted to address something else that Susan said, asked, and that was why isn't DC doing X, Y, or Z? And in fact, Kathy just added to that list glass and other things. And Susan, did you sit in on Che's meeting the other week? She had a session, her hearings. Did you listen to her hearing? Oh, well, I'm sure then you recall her comment about leadership. And all of these good ideas are there. The economics of, Mike just presented the economics of landfill over incineration. The economics on composting is there. It's all plain what the city has to do. And in terms of glass, it's ridiculous. We're paying $125 a ton to recycle glass, and it doesn't get recycled, and we have to ship it 25 miles. So the whole thing is irrational. And I think we'll get to what we're going to do with all this information in a minute. So the answer to why we're not doing X, Y, and Z is we have to have some seismic shift at the leadership. Someone has to be put in charge that one wants to do it. The person doesn't even have to know how to do it, because we had Chris Shorter 2 or 3 years ago who didn't know anything, and he was terrific. We were working with him. He was learning. We were learning. So we need someone who wants to solve the problem as opposed to the cronies we've been getting.
And there's also
the bottom line. Excuse me. Go ahead, Chris.
I'm sorry. And there is the element of it, which one of the reasons that Chris Shorter and then Chris Geldart, the two directors, were not able to do much of anything on multiple fronts, was because the mayor wasn't enthusiastically supporting these initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the problems there's a couple problems. One of the problems with us moving forward with the bill is that the mayor, with her transmittal letter, I was trying to convey how important that transmittal layer. She immediately, with sending over that report to the council, put a line in the sand and said, look, the study supports what we've been dragging our feet on for a long time. And so that's why this legislation that Mike is proposing is such an important thing. But the other thing that's going to be problematic is that, I've already noticed Councilmember Che, who's just been wonderful to us on this, she's transitioning out. And this is a big project. When the mayor has put a line in the sand on, and saying that we're doing everything right, we're going to continue to, she's fundamentally saying we're going to continue to contract with Covanta. We're going to have to back up. If we can convince Mary to introduce a bill, or someone else, we have to also look at that. We're going to have to really work extra hard. And I'm hoping that Mike's looking to do things like some of the stuff, wonderful advocacy actions and activities that they've done in places like Baltimore, and which really have gotten a lot of attention. I think we need to immediately start planning and looking for education opportunities to engage the media and to show up at the council and start showing that there's a lot of people that care about this, because we're going to need that momentum and that energy to move forward with Mary's office, who's kind of on a short-termers mode, and because the mayor has put that line in the sand. So this is a big campaign, and we need help on it. Yes, Neil.
Yeah, I'd like to underscore big campaign and mention that last night I sat in on a presentation by Judith Enck, and I think it's Beyond Plastic campaign. It was very very well done. My point is, she called the meeting as an emergency to deal with an issue that we're not dealing with here. But I thought it was a very effective technique. She had hundreds of people. It was nationwide, of course, and we're just a city, well, a region. But I think a bunch of us, including perhaps some elected official or others, calling an emergency meeting, just a short, I think her presentation was no more than a half an hour. But let's lay the facts out. We have people to lay it out with charts, etc. It was a very effective technique, and I think we won't get hundreds, but we could get 30 or 40 people who will make their wishes known, motivated, and that would be one of the next steps we can consider. Also, we could talk about this in detail as a strategy meeting, but at some point, Mike, we need you to officially send something to the government, whether the mayor or the DPW, so we have a document to refer to, which I assume you were planning on anyway.
Yeah, letter, maybe a letter.
Yeah, but it needs to be.
Yeah.
I know you got a lot of work to do and you're trying to wage these campaigns all over the country. But fundamentally a letter, a couple page letter could probably do that and just put,
Yeah, and as far as the
Your
campaign, you don't have to do the campaign on your own. We'll all chip in to, bug the media, et cetera, whatever approaches we want to take to that.
This is your opportunity. Awana, have any ideas come to mind from DOE? We need your love and support.
Chris, what about, excuse me, I'm sorry, but what about we did with Marion Barry? We could start bringing some garbage to City Hall.
It's time. It's time.
It worked.
Not to put you on the spot, on. I was just throwing. I just want to recognize you're here, and we're hoping you'll transmit some of our frustration to folks working on waste issues in your office. And
sure, yeah, I've been trying to capture the key points that you all have made and taking notes here that I will share with some of my team members that are also interested and curious to dive deeper on this issue. So. But again, I wanted to be here to learn and listen because I'm relatively new to DOEE and not in DPW, but work on sustainable DC, which of course includes our waste goals. So I appreciate the opportunity to sit in.
We believe in open conversations. We got nothing to hide, and we're just sharing information. And we've got an amazing, with Neil and Mike and Catherine and Susan and many others, we have a really amazing team of zero waste advocates. So that's what we got. And a lot of cities don't have that. And so we're very lucky to bring those resources. And wonderful, I don't know if you know, but it was the DC Environmental Network advocated, put the creation of the District Department of Energy Environment in an environmental agenda back in 1998, I believe it was. And ultimately, all of a sudden now, what's it been many years later, we have 500 people in an agency working on doing the best they can to engage on the environment. So a lot of things going on now that were happening before. Yes, Neil.
Mike, one other thing, excuse me, Chris, one other thing that's going on is the people at Empower DC have created a project called their Environmental Justice Coalition. It's about 30, 35 excellent people all around the city from all kinds of walks of life and stuff. But they're putting together a policy agenda for them that they want to work on, building up to the elections coming. And there is a policy section on waste, which I'm sure they'll be sharing presently pretty soon. Mike has also been a part of that. There are other issues too, transportation, housing. So it's an environmental justice policy goals that does have a good section on waste, which will inform and reinforce what we're doing. And I stay in touch with them, so I'll be happy to be a liaison between us and them. Although everybody is welcome to those meetings. They're very interesting meetings.
Sounds good. So Mike, we're waiting for our marching orders. Let's see at that meeting. Hopefully we'll get the final date for the meeting with Mary Chey. And then maybe post that, we bring a coalition together of all these different groups. And maybe you could propose some strategies and kind of be our leader. I mean, you're my leader on incineration, so, and Neil too. Neil knows a lot about incineration. But
all the help I can get is appreciated. So I'm stressed, more thin than humans should be stretched. I'd be invisible.
That's why we're there for you.
So I'm glad to see everyone here, and I will try to provide the leadership on just the policy end of it. But any kind of media outreach, other kind of work, totally appreciated.
Yeah, let us know, Mike, as soon as possible. We can dive right into it. We're half working on, well, you know what's going on. Thanks, Mike. Very, very helpful.
Any last words from anyone? Last chance. Thank you so much for showing up.
Chris.
And let's go. Let's get it done. I think we can get it done. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks all.